There is a collection of teachings called the Suttas, which represents some of the earliest historical teachings of the historical Buddha, the handsome gentleman behind me. And sutta has a few different meanings, but one way I like to think about the category of the suttas, the teachings called suttas, it's a conversation. So this is a conversation that the Buddha had with someone or a group of people. And on the night of the Buddha's passing, all of his students and his attendants, especially his cousin Ananda, who was his personal attendant for 25 years, they all got together at the time of the Buddha's passing, and they had their first like convocation, their first whole Sangha meeting. And the purpose of it was to each person in turn to talk about what the Buddha had taught them. And then they were able to kind of triangulate between who was there and who wasn't there that day, or, oh, I heard that. And this is in pre-literate India. For some reason, India, unlike other places, India didn't like to write things down. It's kind of an interesting cultural quirk. In fact, in the ancient Hindu tradition, there's this idea of shastri and smriti. These are two different categories of religious teaching. Shastri is what's written down. And this is considered a very low category, a second-rate category of religious teaching. Smriti is what was spoken into your ear from your teacher and remembered. In fact, smriti has the same root that we get sati, our word that we translate as mindfulness. It's, in a way, it's to remember. Like, mindfulness can be thought of as like, oh wait, what was I doing right now? Oh, that's right, I'm paying attention. That's right, I'm present in my life. So, this ancient Indian subcontinent kind of quirk of things that are written. You don't write precious things down in ancient pre-literate India. Something that's really important, you speak into another person's ear and into their heart. So you can imagine this group of, some sobbing, some crying, some laughing, some solemn students of the Buddha the very night of his passing, going around, what did he say to you? 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 And this is how the earliest strata of the teachings of the Buddha were kept, were held. And it was kept like this and memorized and taught and retaught and turned into kind of poems with mnemonic devices and held like this for hundreds of years actually, until it was finally written down, until there was a sufficient cultural shift that it was finally written down in the Pali language. So, this is a teaching, this is a recording of a conversation from these suttas. This one is called the Dona Sutta because it's a conversation between this person Dona and the Buddha. And it goes a little something like this. Thus have I heard. That's how all the suttas begin, because it's something that someone heard. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Buddha was traveling along the highway between the cities of Ukata and Satavya. A brahmin by the name of Dona was also traveling along the highway some distance behind the Blessed One. As Dona walked, he saw a strange and wonderful thing. He saw a 1,000-spoked wheel upon the Blessed One's footprint, with rims and hubs complete in all respects, and he thought, this is astounding and very strange. Surely these could not be the footprints of a human being, of an ordinary man. Brief note. In ancient mythological traditions of India, including Hinduism and Jainism, there's this idea, this concept that you can kind of extract a lot of meaning, you can kind of identify a lot of meaning and information based on the signs, marks, physiology, and even color of a person. Just like we do nowadays, for better and for worse, right? In our global culture for a very long time now, we have been under the illusion that we can know something about someone based on what they look like. Color of their skin, how tall or short, their facial features, etc. You can see how dangerous that can be. It was like that even then. Then the Buddha left the highway and sat down at the foot of a tree, folding his legs crosswise, straightening his body, and establishing mindfulness upon his breath. Tracking the Buddha's footprints, the Brahmin Dona saw him sitting at the foot of this tree, graceful, inspiring confidence, with peaceful faculties and peaceful mind. One who looked like he had attained to the highest taming and serenity of his heart, like a bull elephant with faculties utterly at rest. He was so impressed, he approached the Buddha and said thus, "Excuse me, sir, could you be a god?" The Buddha, with his eyes still closed, said, "I would not be a god, Brahmin." "Could you be a demigod?" "I would not be a demigod, Brahmin." "Perhaps you are some kind of nature spirit, a guardian of this forest." "I would not be a nature spirit, Brahmin." "Well then, you are some kind of man." "I would not be a man, Brahmin." Dona said, "Well, now I am deeply confused. When I ask you what manner of being you would be out of all the classes of beings that I know there to be in the world, you say you are none of them. What manner of being are you? What are you, sir?" And the Buddha said very calmly, very compassionately, "Brahmin, listen to me. I have abandoned the mental formations, the fabrications and patterns of thought and mind by which I would become a deva, I'll use the English, by which I would become a god, a demigod, a spirit, or a man. I have cut them off at the root, made them like palm stumps, abandoned these patterns of heart and mind, so that they are no longer subject to future arising within me. Just as in nature, a blue, red, or white lotus flower, though born in the muddy water, grown through the muddy water, rises above the muddy water, and stands unsoiled by the muddy water. Even so, though I was born in the world, grown up in the world, I have overcome the world, and I dwell unsoiled by this world. Brahmin, listen to me. Remember me as awake." Thus ends the Dona Sutta. Thus have I heard. Recap. A member of the priestly Hindu caste sees something strange, footprints bearing wheels. These wheel footprints have some kind of folkloric mythological relevance to this person, this Dona, this priest. And this symbolism is somehow adopted into Buddhist thought. In fact, this statue behind me is a very modern innovation. For the first few hundred years after the Buddha's passing, no actual figures, human figures of the Buddha were allowed. This was an innovation that was granted to the greater Buddhist world by our dear friends the Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks who lived in Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush, and in large quantities actually converted to Buddhism. But they said, we love your religion, but we see you don't have any nice statues of this wonderful Buddha person. We'll fix that for you. Look at this nice man, he's so handsome with his toga. And so this kind of tradition of figures of the Buddha. In fact, you can find in museums all over the world these beautiful Hellenic Greek statues of the Buddha with the toga and a mustache, and he's very handsome and strapping. Probably don't look like that at all. but we'll forgive them because it's a nice statue. But for the first few hundred years after the Buddha's passing, the only icons, the only iconography or symbols of the historical Buddha that were, let's say, accepted by the greater Buddhist community were empty footprints where he once stood. So you would go somewhere where the Buddha taught, where he lived, and you would see a shrine with an empty space and 2 footprints with wheels upon the footprints. Maybe meaning on some level, wherever this man went, he took the Dharma. He took the wheel of the law with him, and he preached. It's also, to me, very poignant to see the absence of this great man, the absence of the Buddha that I follow. So anyway, it's interesting in the story that it makes it into this conversation and then is immediately dropped. It never gets brought up again in the conversation. It's what attracts Dona to the Buddha, and the Buddha doesn't even address it, which makes me think maybe it was a cultural artifact that they just kind of slipped in there for effect. So Dona is attracted to the Buddha by this strange symbol that has religious relevance for him. He sees him from a distance. He looks like a man, but then he draws closer and he's like sitting in a way he's never seen anyone sit before. Something's going on for Dona. He's having some kind of experience. He's seeing someone breathing, sitting, resting in a way that maybe he's never seen. Someone who is utterly at peace from the bottoms of his feet to the top of his head. And of course, what is significant for the Buddha isn't what his feet look like, but how his mind is. Not what kind of category of being he might belong to in Hindu cosmology, but how his mind is. Dona asks the Buddha, what to Dona is a very sensible question. What are you? And the Buddha immediately subverts his question and instead says how he is. I'm not even a man to your understanding of what a man would be. I'm awake. And this is a category difference. Different in kind, and maybe even more strange and powerful than the gods, the demigods, the great nature spirits that populated the world of Dona at that time. And why is the Buddha beyond all of Dona's categories, even a man? Because, as the Buddha says, I have abandoned those mental formations, those fabrications and patternings of heart and mind by which I would become any of these things. I have cut them off at the root, obliterated them, abandoned them, so that they are no longer subject to future arising. But what could our state of heart and mind possibly have to do with what kind of being we are? It is fundamental to the Buddha's teachings that whatever, and this is a quote, whatever one pursues with their thinking and pondering, thus becomes the inclination of their awareness. As a person thinks, so they become. This is absolutely the heart of the engine of the gradual step-by-step teaching that the Buddha offers his students and us. We have the power to gently, gradually cultivate this mind of peace, this heart of loving kindness. In the Dhammapada, verse 1, the Buddha says, all experience is preceded by the mind, created by the mind, and have the mind as their master. If one speaks or acts from a corrupted mind, suffering will follow, as the cartwheel follows the ox's hoofprint. All experience is preceded by the mind, created by the mind, and have the mind as their master. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness will follow, as an ever-present shadow that never leaves. We are the architects so many times of our own suffering. We can directly affect this for the better. Cultivate, harness, and grow a heart and mind of wisdom and loving kindness. There was a student of the Buddha named Soma Bhikkhuni. Bhikkhuni is a female practitioner, a nun. And she was, her story is collected in a collection of teachings called the Theravada, which means poems of the elder nuns. Teddy is a word for like a senior nun, and a gatha is a poem. Maybe for those students of the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, you've maybe heard some of his gathas, his poems. So in this collection called the Theravada, this Soma Bhikkhuni relates her awakening experience. Soma Bhikkhuni is making great progress. She's really digging deep and really kind of, and if you know that when you actually make space for whatever is present in your heart, it's all going to come up. It's all got to come out sometime, right? So Soma Bhikkhuni finds a secluded forest glade for practice. And then her Mara, her kind of personified, internalized misogyny. You can imagine what kind of misogynistic, deeply chauvinistic culture India of 2,600 years ago was, right? Just think of our own shared culture. Okay. So she's sitting there in this deep, peaceful forest glade, dredging up these deep emotional wounds, this trauma, this material, psychological material, and a voice comes up in her head, this social conditioning. And the voice in her head says, you're a woman, only a woman. What woman thinks they can attain to the supreme unbinding? You should be home raising children, cleaning cooking pots and serving a man. Rather than collapsing and clinging to this critique, this internalized social conditioning, rather than pushing it away and activating, going to full aversion, and rather than either of these two extremes, Soma Bhikkhuni, the wise Soma Bhikkhuni, just rests. And very calmly to herself, she says, what does being a woman matter at all when my heart-mind is unified, when my knowledge flows on steadily, as I see deeper and deeper into truth. Now, one to whom the thought would occur, I'm a man, or I'm a woman, or I'm anything at all, that one is fit for Mara to address. That one is fit to fall into illusion, but not me. And the story goes, Mara saw that Soma Bhikkhuni knew him and he fled. This is the kind of model of the story when our deepest internalized toxic conditioning shows up as this Mara, this kind of devil trickster figure. And Soma just says, oh, I see you. That's cute. That's not for me. So, what is it like to be awake like this? The Buddha attempts to describe his awakeness in metaphorical language thus in the sutta. Dona, just as a red, blue, or white lotus flower, though born in muddy water, grown up in muddy water, rises above muddy water and stands unsoiled by it, Just so, though born in the world and grown up in the world, I have overcome the world and dwell unsoiled by the world. But perhaps this metaphor has a kind of anti-world dualism to you. I know it does for me. I love this story. I always loved it. But it always was like, when I hear about people overcoming the world, it sounds a little dualistic to me. I want to invite you to understand another way of thinking about the world that the Buddha has overcome. The world that the Buddha speaks of is the world that we construct with our hearts and minds. Many times in the suttas, the Buddha talks about awakening being at the end of the world. He goes on to ask his audience, and where is this end of the world to be found? He says, why, in this very fathom-long body. After all, the world is made of form, feeling, perception, mental activity, and consciousness. The constant, compulsive, habitual fabrication of world other, of self other, this dualizing construction that I do all the time. I look out through my senses and I see a world out there. There's no world out there. The only world I could ever experience is in there. The end of the world. The end of the world is what happens when I stop making the world. In those moments when the heart and mind are unified and quiet, in those moments when you see that impossibly beautiful sunset or sunrise, in the embrace of a loved one, maybe a really phenomenal cup of coffee, there's all these little hints when we come fully into the body, when we enter into some kind of rapture and we come back to our senses. This construction of self-other, of object-subject, starts to get very thin and very porous. And it allows us to participate in a much lighter and freer way in this world. An awakened one cannot be contained or constrained by any category, role, trope, or identity, even while using them skillfully. Friend, teacher, loved one, companion, etc. All of these identities have their utility. And their utility ends the very instant they are no longer called for by the arising moment. Then they become a hook, a trap, muddy water, a world to be ended. This is why we train in meditation, in this way of meeting experience. Because in this life, if we're very lucky, you will have so many roles. You've already had so many roles. How beautiful. Parent, child, brother, sister, lover, friend, etc. How enriched and what a field of practice to enact and embody compassion, wisdom, kindness, patience. By finding our home, not in the role, but just behind it, on that naked, raw, ambiguous edge, that open, boundless, empty place that is the field in which any role can arise and pass away, like each breath. That is the way we are able to participate fully in this world and also drop it at any point. so that we may break our habit of constructing a self from personal, cultural, social, mental, or physiological artifacts, and come again to rest in the moment, in this now, in this now. In the eternal question, how am I right now? And that's why when we sit, there's countless techniques, but they all begin with like that. You may have seen this poem going around. I think I saw it on some cutesy Instagram page. It goes a little something like this. To love someone long term is to attend 1,000 funerals of the people that they used to be. And that goes double for yourself. If you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you will die 100,000 times in your life and be reborn again and again and again and again. Awake, open, and available to experience.